This is the modern European history lecture for Thursday, the 13th of May, 2021. The wolf is loose. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is lost. What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches forth towards Bethlehem, waiting to be born. That wasn't entirely from Yeats, the second coming, but it indicates what has happened. Pandora's box is cracked open, and the world is about to suffer its greatest trauma yet. Arguably, the Second World War begins in 1914 when the First War begins because they're inexorably connected, inextricably so. Japan begins the Second World War in 1931 when it invades Manchuria due to a plot of junior officers. But for most of the world, September 1st through 3rd, 1939, is when World War II actually begins. In the wee hours of the early morning of September 1st, 1939, Hitler's forces invade Poland, and by September 3rd, the British finally declare war, and so do the French. To the United States, of course, the war doesn't really begin in earnest until December 7th, 1941, and the war ends in Europe in May of 1945, and in Japan in August of 1945. Though I can assure you, everyone who lived through that time expected the Japanese War to last probably until 1950 or beyond. It's a godsend that ended that war. So, we begin. The Axis powers are the Rome, named after the first alliance between the fascist powers, the Rome-Berlin Axis, because the notion was that Rome is south of Berlin and the axis of the world goes through Rome and Berlin. In other words, the world revolves around what Rome and Berlin are doing. This expands to include Japan in 1941, which is called the Tripartite Pact. So the Axis powers are ultimately Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies, from the French word alliance or alliance, is composed at first of Britain and France and Poland, and later it will be Britain, the Soviets, and the Americans as the heart of the Allies. And the Allies ultimately morph into the United Nations organization. In Poland, the world is introduced to a new type of warfare. Lightning war, blitzkrieg. Lightning is blitz in German, Krieg is one of their words for war, so blitzkrieg, lightning war. I will explain what is different between what we have been accustomed to, which is trench warfare, and blitzkrieg. In trench warfare, the attack happens along the long edge of a very long front. You've got one side, you've got the other side, and if this side is going to attack, the artillery back here is going to paste this side, weakening it either with a short, sharp barrage or with long saturation barrage. And then a broad attack by infantry across no man's land at the speed of walking. Maybe by the end of the war on the Allied side, including slow, light, and heavy tanks, is launched along the entire front, miles and miles and miles wide. And this attack will probe for weaknesses in the enemy trenches, maybe penetrating here or there. If successful, capturing enough of the trench so the enemy withdraws to the next trench line, where it starts over again. The characteristics of trench warfare are a walking pace of advance and a broad attack, like getting hit with the cutting edge of a sword in a slashing attack. That's trench warfare, and it's pretty horrific. as I think I've tried to indicate, and as you've seen and read. Blitzkrieg is entirely different. Blitzkrieg is rooted in the internal combustion engine. Without the internal combustion engine, no blitzkrieg. What blitzkrieg involves is a concentrated simultaneous attack on one spot in the enemy line. One spot. I'm sort of pointing up here to give you an indication. Tanks, followed by trucks, assisted by aircraft, a mobile airborne artillery, hit one spot in the enemy line. It is not a broad attack. It is not a slashing attack. It's a single thrust, like a fencer will thrust forward with the point of the weapon. The point of the blitzkrieg is to overwhelm all defense in this spot, penetrate and drive past the enemy trench lines. Aircraft provide the shock, so do tanks, fast tanks that move at the speed of a car rather than the speed of a walk. These tanks are followed by mechanized infantry and trucks, and the goal is to cut through the lines and go miles and miles and miles beyond and drive more and more and more forces through this gap. What that's going to do is leave troops on either side of the gap in a horrible position because the attacking army, the Germans in this case, will be in front of them, but more and more Germans every minute of every hour are behind them too, cutting them off. And if this attack is repeated elsewhere on the line, then those German units can encircle these forces, trap them, and then destroy them in detail. The whole point of blitzkrieg, of lightning war, is speed and concentration of fire. Speed and concentration of fire. Speed and concentration of fire. Like an arrow hitting armor, or a crossbow bolt hitting armor. If you're wearing the most modern late medieval armor, you're wearing a layer of padding, you might be wearing a layer of chain underneath, you might not, and then you've got a plate of steel. If you shoot a crossbow bolt at an armored knight in the 1400s, your crossbow bolt is going to be driven by a steel cable, not by a rope. The amount of force applied by that steel cable upon the little bolt, bolts are about this long, and bolts are often also made of steel, is probably going to be enough if you hit the armor at the right angle, straight on. If you hit it at too acute an angle, it's going to bounce off. But if you hit a knight on a flat piece of armor with a good crossbow shot, it'll go right through. No matter how much steel you've got, you can't carry too much because you're a human being, you're not Superman. It's going to go through the steel, through the fabric, through your flesh, past your ribs, into your organs, and you might end up with one shot, one kill. When gunpowder comes along, this is even more the case, because a shot fired with the force of gunpowder is certainly going to cut through armor like a hot knife through butter. The chance of deflection that a crossbow bolt or an arrow is going to have doesn't exist nearly as much with gunpowder weapons. The reason that people stop wearing armor in battle is because the more the enemy is armed with firearms, the less it matters. You might as well move fast and hopefully avoid getting shot rather than move slow with armor, because the armor will not protect you. And the truth is, that is the case until the 1970s and 80s when we begin to develop Kevlar. The steel helmets worn in World Wars I and II, Korea and Vietnam, are there to stop shrapnel, exploded bits of grenades and artillery shells, which fly at a certain speed. A bullet will go through one of those helmets without any trouble. And if it does, you're dead. So armor becomes obsolete because of the amount of force that hits that one spot. That's the point of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is developed by a German general named Heinz Guderian, based on theoretical work by a British tank theorist named Littlehart. And in the end, Hitler at first is not convinced of Blitzkrieg, but it works in Poland. People expect that when Hitler attacks Poland, things are going to bog down like they did in World War I. In World War I, it took the Kaiser's army about two and a half years to conquer Poland. They expected the same thing of Hitler. When Stalin moved in from the east, the expectation still is that Poland will hold out for a while. But with Blitzkrieg, Poland is penetrated in half a dozen places on day one from around 3/4 of its border. From the south, the west, and from the north. And the Polish army is encircled and destroyed in detail. So in 6 weeks, the Nazis conquer Poland. The Soviets take the eastern third of the country. The National Socialists take the western 2/3. Now, there's an interesting side note in the case of Poland. Because of the Polish strategy to pull east, hold out against the Germans until the Allies can come and to their aid, the Polish army's best officers were in the east and were captured by the Soviets. Like the Germans, the Soviets had no use for intelligent Polish leaders. So, what did they do? Well, in the West, what the Nazis did is they would invite college professors and teachers, architects, and politicians to various events soon after the conquest with the pretext or the pretense that these Polish leaders were going to be utilized by the Nazis to help rule their fellow Poles. But they were sent to concentration camps. They were not utilized. The Nazis wanted Poles for slave labor. They didn't want the Poles to have an intelligentsia. The Soviets were a bit more direct about it. The Soviets, after holding the Polish army prisoner for about 6 months, early in 1940, brought them to the Katyn Forest on the borders between Poland and the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union. And there they massacred them all. The typical method was to have a truckload arrive at a hut, and there was this line of huts. So the trucks would arrive, and a truckload of Polish officers would get out. One by one, they'd be sent into the building. They'd be being rushed, frog-marched by the Soviet troops. And they burst into a door, and there's a guy sitting at the desk, and he looks up. And as he looks up, the guy standing behind the door plugs him in the back of the head, one bullet, and then the body is put into a chute and gotten rid of, and the next officer is sent in, and the next. It's a pretty efficient assembly line, turning living Polish officers into dead Polish officers. Over 10,000 of them were killed in this way, and the Soviets buried them in a shallow grave. In an act of propaganda that can only be described as richly ironic, when the Germans march into Russia in June of 1941, they discover what happened at Katyn Forest. They dig up the graves. They bring film and print journalists, photojournalists, to the Katyn Forest, and they spent significant money trying to identify the remains of the Polish officers in order to try to get the world on their side against the barbarity of the Soviet Union. Now, had it been the Kaiser's army, that might have meant something. But these are the Nazis, and they are not humanitarians. So in terms of who is worse, Hitler or Stalin, the truth is you're dealing with a guy who kills between 16 and 20 million people and a guy who kills between 30 and 60 million people. In both cases, you're dealing with some of the worst mass murderers in human history. Actually, the second and third most effective mass murderers in human history. So having the Nazis call out the communists for their human rights abuses is a bit like the ancient Romans claiming that the Christians were sex fiends because of the kiss of peace. Peace be with you, and also with you. In the ancient church, you kissed on the lips or on the cheeks. You didn't just bow or shake hands like you do in so many modern churches. And the Romans, in their calumnies against Christians, along with calling Christians cannibals for eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ, called Christians sex fiends. These were Romans who had orgy rooms and vomitoria built into their villas and townhouses during the imperial period, utterly decadent Romans. So the Romans calling Christians sex fiends is a lot like the Nazis calling the communists human rights abusers. This is definitely a pot calling the kettle black situation. So the war in the East is settled fast. Well, Stalin is surprised by this. He's surprised by how rapidly Hitler's forces move in, and he's more than a little nervous. So in the late months of 1939 and the early months of 1940, well, we'll start in late 39, Stalin invades and conquers Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the states along the eastern shores of the Baltic. And those people immediately get put through the ringer by the NKVD. What else is on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea besides Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia? Finland. Well, these three used to be part of the old Russian Empire, and the Soviets, if they're going to reclaim that, so the Soviets invade Finland. Just as winter falls, 1939-1940. The Finns are a mixture of a native group that's non-Indo-European in terms of its language. Like the Basques, the Finns basically have a pre-Indo-European people's origin. They're very ancient people. And fairly unique in bloodline. A mixture of Finns and Swedes is what forms the physicality of most Finns, the heritage of most Finns. And the thing about the Finns is they fight like Afghans. They don't like anyone conquering their territory. And the Swedes, well, Vikings, rather tough warriors when they put their mind to it. So here's what happens. Millions of Soviet troops, including airborne troops, try driving through the Karelian Isthmus, which is the stretch of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. They also try driving along the eastern frontier. The Finns are under a World War I explorer and commander named Marshal Mannerheim. Mannerheim is the man who kept Finland from going communist in 1919-1920. Mannerheim is actually a first-class general. The Finns are first-class soldiers. Let me give you evidence. One of the main Finnish warplanes is the American plane, the Brewster Buffalo. Now, the Brewster Buffalo is built by the Brewster Company, which is a sewing machine manufacturer. The Brewster Buffalo had a pretty much 0% effectiveness in American service when the Japanese attacked us. It was a death trap. Pretty much anyone who flew in it that encountered an enemy plane died or had to bail out because the Brewster Buffalo just couldn't fly like a fighter plane should. It didn't have a powerful enough engine. It was clunky. It was unmaneuverable. The Finns are the only people on Earth to take the Brewster Buffalo and shoot down a lot of planes with it. I still don't know how they did it, but they did it. So the Finns splash a lot of Red Air Force planes, and the Red Air Force is composed of draftees, and the Red Army is composed of draftees. And throughout the mid and late 1930s, Stalin's show trials and purges targeted the leadership of the Red Army because Stalin was afraid of a military coup against him. So the best generals, the creative people within the Red Army, are either dead or in gulags somewhere. So the Red Army is being led by second and third-rate leaders. Its men are in green uniforms in the white of a Finnish winter. And they're not there because they want to be. What the Finns, there's an American journalist who wants to try to capture the horror of war. And he asks a Finnish veteran of this war, well, wasn't it hard to shoot human beings? And he said, yes, of course. They dodge, they duck. They don't want to get shot. You have to aim very carefully. You have to lead your target. But once you figure all that out, it's easy. The journalist is like,
amazing.
In the Winter War, little tiny Finland fights off giant Soviet bear for 3 months. The Soviets get mauled. The world looks on as the Soviet army, which conquered the eastern third of Poland, can't beat Finland. It's embarrassing. Finally, the Finns sign an unfavorable peace treaty as the weather gets warmer, because the fear is that in the summertime the Soviets will be able to fight better. And so the Finns don't lose their independence, but they give up the Karelian Isthmus, and they give up some territory in the east and in the north, but they keep their country. Okay, so things are heating up, but Hitler isn't doing anything. Neither are the Western powers. Chamberlain continues to order the leaflet bombing of Germany. Churchill, who heads up the British Navy, wants to bomb the dams in Western Germany, in their industrial regions, to destroy their electrical power grid and to flood the industrial regions out. Chamberlain says, no, that would be a war crime. We'll continue to bomb with leaflets. It's called the Phony War in the West because basically the trench lines are being dug along the Belgian frontier by the British. The Maginot Line fortifications are manned by the French, and everyone's waiting for the Germans to attack. Waiting. So the German army, which had been concentrated in the east, has time to finish up with Poland, and then, since they have an agreement with the Soviets, march west and concentrate against the French. However, by this time, it's too cold. You don't want to do an attack in winter if you don't have to, so the Germans are going to probably wait until the spring. So from August of 1939 until May of 1940, there's no real activity along this Western Front, the Phony War. However, Hitler is afraid of his iron supply being cut off. A lot of Germany's iron ore comes from Sweden, northern Sweden, and it's shipped out of Sweden to Norwegian ports and is then shipped in barges along the Norwegian coast and into the Baltic Sea, and it lands in Germany. What Hitler's afraid of is that the British will take the Norwegian ports, because Churchill is planning on taking the Norwegian ports. He's head of the Navy now, he's not head of the government. But he convinces the British that it would be a good idea to take Norway's, and that would cut Germany off from Sweden's iron ore. So Hitler decides to preempt the British attack. He sends land forces driving up into Denmark, up the Jutland Peninsula. And with airborne troops and pre-staged Navy forces, he lands in all of the major Norwegian cities simultaneously. Nobody expects an attack like this. The airborne troops that are paratroopers, troops that jump out of airplanes with parachutes, nobody expects them to do much of anything. But Hitler's paratroops and some quick action by Hitler's Navy takes the Norwegian cities. Now, this attack happens as the British are moving in, so there are some Navy battles off the Norwegian coast between Britain's Royal Navy and the German Kriegsmarine. And the British land forces in northern Norway, but the Germans already have forces there. So instead of just occupying an area peacefully, the Germans put up a real fight. Now, the Norwegians, many of them form resistance movements that hide out in the mountains, and the Olympic sport, the biathlon, is invented. The Olympic sport, Winter Olympic sport, the biathlon, is a combination of cross-country skiing and marksmanship with rifles. So it was my favorite Winter Olympic sport back when I watched the Olympics back in 1980. I think was the last time I watched it. So you see these guys in white ski suits skiing with rifles on their back, and then they've got to very quickly stop, take their rifle out, send targets downrange, and then continue. So it's a combination of stamina, speed, and accuracy. And it's based on what the Norwegians did with Hitler's forces, with Norwegian ski troops acting as guerrillas. In the end, the British are driven out and the Norwegians are driven into the mountains, and Hitler conquers Norway and Denmark. He leaves Sweden alone. He doesn't need to conquer Sweden. The Swedes are willing to trade iron ore to him. And so Sweden remains neutral. One of the only neutral countries in Europe, the other one being Switzerland, who pays everyone off to leave them alone.
Sounds like Switzerland.
So, because of the failure in Norway in March and April of 1940, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Munich, of peace in our time, the Prime Minister of leaflet bombing in the West, who at least was forced to declare war, is finally kicked out. Now here comes an interesting turning point moment in history, and it's a little one. The public wants Winston Churchill. Why? Because for the last 10 years, Winston Churchill has been warning the world about the Nazis. He was warning the world 5 years before anyone else took the Nazis seriously. He was warning the world before the Nazis took power. He spent political capital that he didn't have in the early and mid-1930s trying to get Britain to spend more on its military to protect themselves from the Germans' new Air Force and their Navy and their Army. People didn't listen. He was called a crank. But in addition to being fairly prescient about the Nazis, Churchill was loyal, deeply loyal to the monarchy. In the mid-late to late 1930s, the British had a crown prince, a bit like Prince Charles today. He was a man that had issues. And his chief issue was that he, like the current prince, fell in love with a married woman and who later became divorced, an American named Mrs. Simpson. The crown prince, when King George V died, becomes King Edward VIII. And he's this extremely handsome guy that looks wonderful playing tennis. And Wallis Simpson is this very strange, not very beautiful woman that he's just infatuated with. I say it's connected to Prince Charles because Prince Charles, the Crown Prince of England, the Prince of Wales, though he married this delightful young woman, 19-year-old girl named Diana Spencer, had previously been besotted by, fallen in love, head over heels with, a woman named Camilla Parker Bowles, who married another guy because Charles was told she was unsuitable by the royal family. So, Edward VIII is made to make a choice by the British politicians, not by Churchill. You either get to be king and give up Mrs. Simpson, or you get to keep Mrs. Simpson and abdicate. Churchill practically threw himself on his sword for this king, saying, Your Majesty, I'm loyal to you. Whatever you want to do, I'll support. So Churchill, at a moment where he might have gotten more political capital, sacrificed his anti-Nazi campaign a bit to be loyal to his king. Ultimately, King Edward VIII abdicated, and thank the Lord he did. He spent the years leading up to World War II in Germany and near Germany as a friend of Hitler and an admirer of him. Had King Edward VIII been monarch during the Second World War, it's extraordinarily likely that Britain would have surrendered to Germany, that the king himself would have undermined the war effort against his friend, Mr. Hitler. But he was forced to abdicate. Churchill was wrong about it. The new king didn't like Churchill. The political leadership didn't like Churchill. There are reasons I don't have time to go into. So when Chamberlain is out, there's this important moment where the king is going to be making the decision between two politicians. One politician is the darling of the establishment. His name is Lord Halifax. He's this tall beanpole of a man who was the foreign minister who helped Chamberlain do appeasement.
I just like the name Halifax.
That's a neat name. Unfortunately, this Lord Halifax was a man who liked working with him. Halifax was the choice of the establishment and the one the king preferred. Churchill was the one that the people preferred because he would fight the war. Churchill's followers in Parliament, a bunch of young, troublesome young men, begged him to promise one thing. They knew how loyal he was to the king. They knew that the king could bamboozle him into allowing Lord Halifax to become the prime minister. If the king asks you, Mr. Churchill, would you willingly serve Lord Halifax? Churchill's natural generosity and loyalty to the king would make him say, yes, of course. At which point, the king would make Halifax prime minister, and once again, you'd have a prime minister not fully committed to war. Churchill's followers begged him to say nothing. If the king asks that, say nothing. You don't have to say no, you wouldn't serve, just say nothing. And let silence be your answer. So the king asks, and Churchill is silent. And after a few minutes, Halifax himself says, well, the truth is, I'm a lord. I don't think the country should be run by a lord at this time. I think it should be run by a commoner. I'd be happy to serve under Mr. Churchill. And the king goes along, and Churchill becomes prime minister. That's a turning point moment. Because the day after Churchill becomes prime minister, the Nazis finally attack in the West. Now, here's the problem in the West. In World War I, you will remember the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans were going to march through Belgium and sweep north of Paris and cut Paris off. That was the plan. An attack through Belgium to go north of Paris and cut it off. An attack like this. That's what everyone expects. That's what the French commander, Marshal Gamelin, expects. That's what the British expect. So here's the war plan. And Miss Kenner, you're in a horrible position because you are sort of blocked. I hope you can see. If you can't see, feel free to move. Please, I don't want you to be blocked off. When the Germans attack Belgium, the British and French should meet the Germans as far east as possible. However, the king of the Belgians, a different man than his father, who was king during World War I, said, no, I'm not going to let you put troops in Belgium, because then Germany will have an excuse to invade Belgium. I want to be neutral. I don't want the Germans to invade my country. If I don't let British and French forces into Belgium, Germany might leave me alone. So the king of the Belgians refuses to cooperate until Germans invade his country, at which point then he asks for help. So the British and French, anticipating this, have a plan to abandon the trenches they've built for the last 6 months between Luxembourg and the English Channel and move in a wheeling motion north into Belgium to meet the Germans about halfway through Belgium at a place called the Deal Canal. And if the Germans invade Holland, they'll go farther north to the city of Breda. So, the British and French are going to go like this, boop, and they're going to block the Germans, expecting the Germans to come in like they did in 1914. However, Blitzkrieg. There's a new plan. Hitler approves it. The Germans are not going to follow the 1914 plan. They're not going to go in like this. Oh, they'll launch a diversionary attack with a second-rate army to conquer Holland and Belgium. Yeah, they'll do that. And what that will do is that will trigger the wheeling motion of the British and French. They'll concentrate up here. Meanwhile, the real German attack will happen through southern Belgium, a place called the Ardennes, an area of hills and forests considered to be absolutely unsuitable to tanks, so neither the French nor the Belgians guard it heavily because they don't think they need to, because they don't think that anyone will attack through the Ardennes. So, the Germans launched their diversionary attack on Holland and Belgium. The British and French go yip, 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 and wheel into the Deal Canal area of central Belgium and up towards Breda in Holland. As they do this and get to where they are, the Germans cut through the southern Belgian area of the Ardennes, break the French fortress at Sedan, and instead of going to Paris, the Germans are then going to scoop up to the English Channel. What this scooping action will do from the Ardennes up to the Channel is cut off the best forces the British and French have. It doesn't take first-class soldiers to hold the Maginot Line. It takes first-class soldiers to meet the Germans in open battle. So the very best units of the British and French armies are here. The Germans will cut them off from the rest of France, isolate them, and destroy them. So the Germans do this. I must point this out. Marshal Gamelin, a fine old French gentleman, thought that telephones were uncouth, so he wouldn't allow any telephones in his headquarters. Instead, he had people riding messenger motorcycles. That's how he got information. So we have a supreme commander of the French army in the age of radio refusing to have radios or telephones in his mansion of a command center. So he's completely outclassed and he's replaced. But it doesn't matter, because the French army, even though it has more tanks than the Germans, has divided their tanks among all the infantry units, so every infantry unit has a couple of tanks. The whole point of Blitzkrieg is to concentrate your tanks and your planes on a single spot in the enemy lines to cut through. So even though the French tanks are more numerous than the German tanks, and in some cases bigger and stronger than the German tanks, it doesn't matter. The Germans are outclassing the French and the British. The French and the British are fighting a trench warfare style, walking pace war. The Germans are fighting a lightning war. The Germans reach the English Channel. They cut off the British Expeditionary Force and the French forces from the rest of France. Now, at this point, we come to another great turning point. One would expect Hitler's armies to then crush the British and French, and they were capable of doing it. The British and French were being spanked so many times they didn't know which way to fight. Really, they were being attacked from all sides by this point. The British retreat to a port right here on the Belgian-French border called Dunkirk. And at Dunkirk, the British are going to launch Operation Dynamo, where they basically say to any Brit with a boat, go to Dunkirk and get troops off them beaches. Go to Dunkirk and get troops off of the dock. Go to Dunkirk and get troops. So thousands of pleasure yachts and channel ferries and fishing boats, boats of all kinds, including the Royal Navy, surge to Dunkirk. But it's not going to be in time because the German army can crush them like a bug. But now intrude Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering, you may remember, was the successor to the Red Baron in World War I. He took over the Red Baron squadron when the Red Baron died. He was shot next to Hitler during the Beer Hall Putsch, and because of this wound, suffered pain for the rest of his life and became a drug addict. He was also elephantine, super fat, but he was a close friend of Hitler's and he could get the job done, despite his habit. So Hitler made him, among other things, the head of the German Air Force, the head of the Luftwaffe. Goering says, wait, mein Führer, stop the army. Let me prove that the Air Force can destroy the British and French without the army. And Hitler, who's a bit surprised at how quickly and how well this all seems to be going, he's spooked by it, says, okay, and stops the army. The army can't believe it. They've run hard and fast to get here to destroy the British and French before they can escape, and now they're being told to sit back, relax, and have some schnitzel? They're not happy. The German Air Force spends the next 5 days trying to destroy the beaches, which is kind of difficult to do because they're beaches, the docks, which they don't succeed at, and the massive numbers of British and French troops getting ready and being lifted off the shores of Dunkirk. Finally, after, again, about 5 days, the Germans' army is given permission by Hitler to complete the attack. Now, I will say this. I make all sorts of jokes about the French. But at Dunkirk, the French forces took up defensive positions to allow the British and only some of them to escape. Many French soldiers died fighting to allow the British to get off those beaches during the last days of the German attack. But the Germans finally closed it. Dunkirk is closed down, but the British save well over 500,000 men. And these 500,000 men will be the heart of the British Army for the rest of the war. They have to leave all their guns behind. They have to leave their tanks, their artillery. The only way they can do this is if the British force protects them, and it does sort of. Those 500,000 men have skills that are irreplaceable. By letting them go, the Germans actually make it much easier for Britain to go on fighting. Why does Hitler really do this? Does he believe that air power alone can destroy an army, which it can't unless you use atom bombs? The answer is no. Hitler wants peace with England. Hitler wanted to conquer Poland. He didn't want to fight England and France. Hitler's army has made a successful breakthrough in France and is in the process of conquering the country. After Dunkirk, the German army takes Paris and marches south and to the coast. The French army reels before it. Then, 6 weeks after the beginning of the first attack on Holland and Belgium, the French surrender. In June of 1940, the middle of June, to late June, the French army surrenders. Germany has won the war that Hitler wanted. Hitler is going to take northern France, central France, and western France and leave southeastern France independent, puppet country, ruled by the man who saved France at Verdun, Marshal Pétain. He's going to run a collaborationist government, and his excuse is that Vichy France, the country he rules from, this water bottling town of Vichy, that Vichy France is better than no France, and that by collaborating with Hitler, he's protecting the only French that are still left outside of Hitler's control. Hitler wants peace now. He's gotten what he wants. He does not want to fight the English anyway. So he's about to make peace deal with England, he thinks. Slaughtering 500,000 English soldiers and officers is not going to make the English more likely to surrender. So the likelihood is that Hitler allows the British army to escape without any of its guns, without any of its tanks or ammo, in order to prevent angering the English to the point where they won't make peace with him. The moment that France surrenders, Hitler offers the best peace deal he's ever offered anyone. Britain will be a partner of Germany, not a conquered country. Britain will keep its navy, will keep its air force, will keep its empire. Germany will get back the colonies it lost at the end of World War I, but for the rest, Britain keeps its empire. The partnership will be this. The Brits will be allowed to rule the rest of the world, or dominate it anyway, with Germany's help. Britain will be stronger with Germany's help. And Germany will guide policy on the continent of Europe, and the British will support that. So Britain keeps its independence, keeps its colonies, keeps its navy, keeps its form of government while accepting German guidance and German partnership and German leadership. Whether Britain's Jews were going to have to be at some point given up to the Nazis is unclear, but Hitler certainly didn't lead with that. A lot of the smart people in England at this point says, France, look, Corporal Hitler did in 6 weeks what Kaiser Wilhelm couldn't do in 4 1/3 years. Air power renders the Royal Navy obsolete. The Germans are preparing Operation Sea Lion, an attack on Britain. We have got to make peace. Only Churchill says no. Only Churchill. Lord Halifax wants to make peace. The king doesn't talk about it, but he wants to make peace. The leadership of the Conservative Party, that's supposed to be loyal to Churchill but is still loyal to Chamberlain, want peace. Everyone wants peace except for this man. Churchill instead says, we will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the hills. We will fight them on the streets and on the airfields. If they invade these islands and we have to retreat, we will fight them from the New World until the New World comes to redeem the Old World. In other words, we'll go to Canada and keep fighting. We will never surrender. He insists that the war go on. Churchill famously also says that if the British Empire were to last another 1,000 years, let this be our finest hour, where we stood up for what was right against an enemy that seems unstoppable. His decision to fight launches the Battle of Britain. And there's a moment where a decision has to be made about France and the French fleet. See, Britain begs the French fleet to leave French ports and go to Britain and not surrender with the rest of the country. But the government in Vichy, the collaborationist partner of Hitler, orders the French Navy to go to North Africa and remain there. The French Navy will not, according to the French government, will not be allowed to fall into German hands. Can the British accept this? You combine the German fleet with the French fleet, and the British are going to have serious problems. Churchill makes one of the most difficult decisions any politician has to make. He sends Royal Navy squadrons into the French Navy bases at Mirza Kabir in North Africa, at Casablanca, and elsewhere. The French admirals are given 3 choices. Scuttle your ships, in other words, sink your own ships here and now. Join us, leave these ports, come to Britain, keep fighting the war as the Free French, or we'll be forced to attack you and sink you. We cannot let you hold on to your ships because we trust that you won't. We'll try not to let the Germans take these ships, but we can't trust that you'll succeed. A few French ships scuttle. A very few French ships go with the British. Most of the French ships under admirals that I have no words for that are fit for a classroom decide no. So the British sink most of the French fleet. This creates an odd bitterness in France. There are many Frenchmen during and after the war, even up to the present day, that are more comfortable with the Nazis than they are with the British because they felt betrayed by the British at Mirza Kabir and elsewhere. They felt betrayed that the British sank the French fleet. I invite you to examine the psychology of this because it's interesting. So where we're going to leave things is the Battle of Britain is about to begin because Churchill makes his great decision. And after, I'll leave that until after. Questions, comments, or thoughts? Yeah.
quite a bit earlier. You talked about like Hitler and Stalin being the second and third most effective mass murderers. Is the first Mao Zedong?
Yep. Mao Zedong, communist dictator of China, kills between 80 and 120 million of his own people in peacetime. Nobody beats Mao, at least yet. And the current dictator of China, Xi Jinping, is a great admirer of Mao. So, not a happy. Thank you. Yeah.
Edward is the uncle of Elizabeth, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Elizabeth's father, King George VI, was Edward's younger brother.
Yeah, and then he abdicated. Yeah.
And then George becomes king, and Elizabeth becomes princess regent,
Okay.
or princess, crown princess.